was kind enough to send us information. And I got to tell you, I can't believe one person could do all this.
Nothing goes through that.
I can't believe one person could do all this in a lifetime, but anyway, look, maybe you did. A very, very impressive kind of thing. And his education, picking up degrees from Yale, Michigan, Arkansas, New York University. You have really been busy. And so his topic today is on entitled "Black Isn't a Color of the Rainbow." Oh, by the way, he is now a professor. No, he retired.
Yeah, but they don't know that I'm teaching this year. It's just for the semester. Somebody became ill. So.
You know, this is going to sound very familiar to me and my wife because I retired from Syracuse University, 15 years ago or more, and I just went back to teach one more class, and then she claims I did that 6 times. It's hard to stay away when you're having fun, folks. Is talk entitled "Black Isn't the Color of the Rainbow: American Soldiers in World War I." And Dr. Kelly has, I would say, very broad interests in theater and film and radio, producing technical problems, all of these things. Also communications of various types. And so, and has also been interested, and is also a playwright. So as you watch a play and you see this huge amount of dialogue that somebody produced, and you say, wow, what kind of person would do that? Well, we've got that kind of person, and it's no doubt a very, very hard job. And so we appreciate that. He's been interested in the place of African Americans in many different roles, but also in the military. Now, this kind of, to me, brings back a few memories. And Irene and I sometimes talk about one of the good points about being old is that you have memories of things that happened a very long time ago.
You're lucky.
I know. I know. For example, it was in 1948 that Harry Truman signed an executive order integrating the armed forces. And some of you young people may think, why did that have to be done? Isn't it obvious? All different races can serve, and they want to. Well, I go back to my uncle. I had an uncle who, at the time of World War II breaking out, was hugely interested in airplanes. And he saved his money, and he took flying lessons, and he hung around the little airport near our hometown. And then the war came, and yes, he did enlist in the Air Force. He did learn to fly. He flew B-17s. He did all those things, but possibly and probably a person, say an African American, may not have that same pathway to go in World War II. But Dr. Kelly's taking us back to World War I, when many, say, white soldiers thought there shouldn't be African Americans fighting with them. Let's go back to World War II for a minute. World War II, I remembered vaguely from something I read about the Tuskegee Airmen, that they decided to give, okay, let's give some people their own unit and see what they can do, and they did very, very well. And so I thought, are people interested in that? And so I went to Amazon and I typed in Tuskegee Airmen, and you wouldn't believe the number of books that have been written about that. But Dr. Kelly's going to take us back to World War I. And our country, as you probably know, entered that war rather late. But France had been fighting and getting depleted and people getting killed, and they were happy to take some of these African American soldiers, and they performed very well and did a really excellent job. So we look forward to having you take us back. And let's hope the equipment works. Dr. Samuel Kelly, the audience is yours.
You know, as you get older, much of your anxiety comes from the anticipation of things not working. So early this week, the hard drive died, the external hard drive, and I had all of my Syracuse lectures on that. But I went to Staples, and the guy said, well, you know, you can probably get that corrected for about $1,500. So I came back home, and I have a young tech, or actually tenant who's an architect degree, and he's very busy working at Cornell, went to Cornell. And I said, you know, I don't know if I can recover this data, so take a look at this. And at some point, you just go numb and you just don't worry about it. Kind of like when I lost my passport in France, and I had 3 presentations coming up that same week. I just didn't have the energy to think about it. So he comes over to my office from his bedroom and said, oh, I think I've corrected it. But let's try put that in, and started that whiz sound again. When you hear that word noise, you're going to get scared, right? So he took it over to his room and came back and said, okay, I got it moved over to the hard drive. So he said it said thump on it for a while, and then it might come to life. So that thump saved me $1,500. Thank you, Staples. This group of people here, these are actually department members at the University of La Rochelle in France, where I taught last year. The woman that you see here, she came to Cortland in the spring semester, and she exchanged places with me. She taught here, and I taught at her University of La Rochelle, which is on the Atlantic Ocean. It's western. It's one of the youngest university there. It's a full comprehensive university. Next to her is actually an American who teaches at the university. Then there's my picture, and on the other side is her husband. So they came with their preschool daughter, took my apartment in Cortland. I had to get an apartment really downtown La Rochelle, overlooking the port, open to the Atlantic Ocean, because I did not risk getting a car in France, and they lived way out in the countryside. But they're giving here a Thanksgiving dinner for me, which I was most grateful to have, because they don't have Thanksgiving in France. I don't drink wine, and I don't drink, you know, I eat dirt and cheese, but I was most grateful. But you will see a picture of me at some point in wine tasting, because if I pay $75 for that tour, I am going to drink some wine. But my stomach doesn't like it. And this is the woman who came to court and recruited me. She's actually French, and she met her American husband. And the woman in the back is also James's wife, and the over here Greek professor. So that was exchange program. I was also invited there to actually do research and develop a play on the black soldiers in World War I in France. And the young man here is actually grew up in Oneida, went to Cortland, was my advisee, moved to Paris, and was a fashion model for 10 years there. And he was a gracious host when I went to tour and visit France. That's his wife, to-be. They came home to Oneida. He got engaged. This is Mr. I'll never get married. But anyway, he's totally humble now, and they'll have their wedding here in Oneida next summer. And he's already sent me the information. I had a chance to do quite a bit of touring and to see some of the historical sites. He also was with me when we went to Versailles, and some of you have probably been into that space. This is the famous Louvre Museum, and people do love their selfies. I kind of perfected the art of doing selfies, because this is a selfie, but I'm not the star of the selfie. I want my friends to see the museum, and so I take a back seat to the selfie. And I started getting notices from classmates and friends, and I really appreciate you sending us this information, because I'm learning a lot. And so this is a group of high school students. They look like college students that I visited also to give a presentation in several of the high schools there in La Rochelle. This is a group of retired French women. Every year they go on tour, and they do one day-long tour and then a week-long tour. And so they actually invited me to go along with them. And that's the woman there in the blue with the sweater on her shoulder. Anne-Marie teaches English in France. And so I was one of 2 guys. The one in the back, the gray-haired guy, was a spouse, and the other guy was actually a tour guide that met us on the bus. So we spent a week-long tour in Montauban. And this group has interest in history in France, and they take this week off. And this is a booklet that they sent me about last month from their tour in France that I went with them, and they can hold this for some of you to take a look at later on.
Do you offer it in English?
Is it in English?
Yes. No, not the book, but your presentation.
Yes, in English, yeah. In the high schools?
Yes.
Yeah, these are English classes. And so they were actually glad to have someone to come in and do that. When I gave the presentation at the Artist Center that invited me last fall, that was actually in English, but we had it interpreted. But we also had students there. The university is an international university, and I was teaching a class with 200 and some students, and so most of the students know how to speak English, so I was teaching the classes in English. But they also did a translation of scenes from my play in French, which was quite wonderful, and also in English, so that worked out quite well. So that's some background, but I was there for the, as I said, to do research as well the first semester, and then the last 2 months I had a chance to really to tour. And since I'm with a group of here, the Historical Society, you know the value of getting out and doing these kinds of tours. It's really an amazing kind of experience for you to have. I was trying to sneak in a few more pictures this morning. That's the that's the slide presentation that wouldn't work when we got here. So I went back to my backup on Wednesday. I was giving a presentation.
Where is that?
This is, thank you for asking, this is Romaine, Argonne New Cemetery, the largest American cemetery in Europe. And this is from World War I. And so I had a chance, this was a guy who gave me a 9-hour one-on-one tour, and it was quite amazing as we were going through the battlefields. We found the Harlem Hellfighters site, monuments to them. I think I held on to those monuments to some of the other regiments that were there, African-American regiments, and also in the other places. This is really the only place at this point where whites and blacks could be together, and that was the cemetery. Woodrow Wilson, as you know, declared war against Germany, and his most famous line was, the world must be made safe for democracy. America was very reluctant to get into the war, and Wilson ran on the platform that he would not go to war. However, when it became clear that Germany had their sights set on America, when a cable was intercepted, a message with Germany trying to get Mexico to join in with them against the United States, at that point, America decided to go to war. But it did not really have an army, except for a few thousand men. And they had to mobilize, as you know, and they started the selective service. And African Americans, with few exceptions, united behind America. And they said, okay, well, this is a chance for us to prove that we not only love our country, we can fight for our country. And so the black leaders began to use this rallying cry, let's fight now for respect, let's show the world that we can fight, let's support this cause. And with the exception of a few people, most of them joined. This is W.E.B. Du Bois, the most famous African-American, probably of the earlier part of the 20th century. And Du Bois was the first black to get a PhD from Harvard. He was working with a Crisis magazine. The NAACP had been formed, and that was a multicultural group, and this group really came together and said, all right, let's close ranks while this war lasts. We'll get our special grievances, close our ranks, shoulder to shoulder with our own white citizens and the allied nations that are fighting for democracy. And so this closed ranks, if you will, message and speech was the one that became the message for blacks to become a part of that. This is Emmett J. Scott. He was the special assistant to the Secretary of War. They needed that kind of connection to help build the notion of blacks coming in and supporting the war. He is a protege of Booker T. Washington, as you know, who founded, really, the Tuskegee Institute and served as the president of that organization, but Washington has died by now. This war did not occur in isolation, as you just heard from the professor. What's your name again?
Chuck.
Chuck, okay, Chuck. All right. Everything was going on. And so blacks had begun to migrate to the north because of what was happening in the south. There were race riots going on in America that same year in 1917. In Houston, for example, some black soldiers had gotten fed up with the racism that was going on against them and the violence and abuse. And they had a confrontation with whites, and that led to the Houston race riot. And that riot resulted in 13 black soldiers being lynched by the military in Houston. And the play, in fact, that I'm working on now is about 12 black men up for being lynched in Elaine, Arkansas, where I grew up, because they were trying to start a union. And of course, when they fired into the church where they were meeting, that led to a riot also. But when they came back from the war in 1919, there were about 37 riots that took place in America that's most known. The NAACP had been formed in 1910, around that time, and it was a multicultural group. In fact, the founding president was a well-known white lawyer and the most probably ablest constitution lawyer, I should say, in America. And he was the one who will go to the Supreme Court to defend these black men who were up to be executed in Elaine, Arkansas, which happens the following year. This is also, remember that in 1857, Dred Scott was told that African Americans could not be citizens because they were of African descent. But then what happens, we got the war, and then following that, we have the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. And I might say that in 1827, my grandfather is actually a slave toiling on a plantation in Huntsville, Alabama. And these are the signs. And so Jim Crow laws were instituted in 1897, and that became the basis for segregation in America. By I believe it was 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. So the Army had been, is now segregated in preparation for this war. And so is America. This is a picture of black soldiers watching a movie somewhere down south. I believe it's somewhere in Texas. And so when we began to look at the war, I believe they're getting their mail or listen to telegraph messages here. But when you have a war, you have to try and unite America or unite a country. And so in the effort to unite the country, they had flyers and posters of black soldiers in very positive, productive-looking circumstances as they're getting prepared to go off to war. Colored man is no slacker. So now we're not the Jim Crow lazy people, we're no slackers. We work really hard for the country along the way. Notice this beautiful poster here, our colored fighters, U.S. official film. So we're making movies, film, flyers, posters to create this aura of interest within the black community. Notice here in this segregated world it says that he draws no color line. When the good Lord makes a record of all of the hero's deed, he draws no color line. So we have to have this not only mobilization in the country to draft these people, because about 2 million blacks were registered for the draft, and we'll see that about almost 400,000 actually served in the Army. Black leaders then demanded that African Americans be made members of the fighting force. The plan for the Army leaders was to bring blacks in as laborers. But the black leaders said, no, we don't want to go as laborers. We want the honor and the glory of fighting men. And so this had become the issue. And so with Du Bois, NAACP, and some others, they began trying to figure out how to address this problem. But there are also some issues going on, because as you know, particularly in the South, they did not invest in black schools, in black education. And during slavery, I'm discussing that area now in my class. We're reading slave narratives. We just did Frederick Douglass this week. Now we're doing drama next week. But it was against the law to read in most places during slavery. And so now you have freedom. Many churches, as you know, affiliated with the North and going south, started schools. But the states themselves had not put money. But if you're going to fight a war, it's not that different today than trying to use computers. Almost anybody who goes to work in Walmart has to know what? How to use a computer, computer literacy. And so they didn't have that experience going, and they decided that, and this is some of the reasons why there were opportunities for the war. Blacks were allowed to have, they started a segregated candidate school, and they commissioned 693 men, but they also had to establish literacy programs for black soldiers. And that proved invaluable because it was through the army that many blacks began to read. They had this regiment from the South, the 371, and when those guys arrived, some of them arrived with croaker sacks on their backs, shoes, chicken in bags. I mean, many of them had come off the farms, so they didn't know how to read. They signed their name with an X. And so this was part of the price that had been paid for not investing in the education. And so the army did this. But the other experience was that these black soldiers had gone to France, and they were also achieving international experience. We know that if you travel abroad, there's nothing like connecting with people from other parts of the world. I've taken our Sweeney Courtney Gospel Choir abroad to England, Germany, Belgium, as well as the Netherlands. Now, what happens, of course, when the men go off to war? The jobs must continue, but we also have to build a war industry, right? And so, who's going to do that work? If the men are at war, the women have to fill in. And so they're not just filling in. By the way, if you haven't seen the film Hidden Figures, which is now playing, I know it's playing in court. I saw it 2 nights ago. My tenant and I were the only 2 people in these 6 theaters Wednesday night. Was it Wednesday or Thursday night? But we were the only 2 people in the entire of 6 theaters. So there's room and you'll find seats there if you go. But it's about black women who were in the background of NASA. We've seen this flight program. We've never thought about the fact that there were women playing an important role, in this case black women. So it's important if you have a chance to see that. But black women are now pulled into the workforce. Not just black women, but women in general, but in particular. And notice this propaganda slide here, cheerfully doing the work required for this great war. So now we've got her pulling this wheelbarrow and now has status, power. Cheerfully, she's happy doing the work to bring democracy to America, to save the world for democracy. Here is another job that's being held by a woman, and they were also part of the war building industry machine. And so these men are coming into these roles, women are coming into these roles. Look at this beautiful picture of women clerical workers. And so opportunities are opening up, but once opportunities begin to open up, women are earning money. We're talking about what else that comes with that? Power, agency, a sense of independence, identity that's not directly connected to the spouse that we see in fences, where everything has to come through. They've earned this right, they've earned this power, out of necessity to move the country forward. This is a black army training camp in Des Moines, Iowa, for instance. This is where the black officers went to train. So we're segregated, but we're also training officers. Now, we had a problem here because America is now about to go abroad internationally. In fact, they've already started with some. We need black laborers, and because the black laborers are really providing the foundation for the infrastructure. So we've got a problem. We're taking hundreds of thousands of black men over. The Army does not want second integration because even if they're integrating in France, it would imply social and racial equality. And most of all, the Southern politicians vehemently oppose to any integration of the military. Well, the black leaders are insisting on fighting units. France, as Chuck said, needs fighting men. So they need fighting men while we're holding back this entire group of people based upon race. So the black leaders are fighting, and they decide what they would do was to create 2 really makeshift divisions. They're not really full divisions, but we have the 93rd and the 92nd. And the 93rd Division is going over to France. Now, these are fighting divisions, And so they're not a part of, or they're not exactly, they're supposed to be a part of the labor force, but that's what they had in mind. And that's when the black people said, no, 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 you said fighting men, this is what these men should be trained to do. So the 92nd fights as a colored body under the American flag. The second-class citizenship must continue in France as it exists in America, but blacks must not return to America, as they say, expecting this sense of racial equality.
Are those last two bullets the agreement with the government of France?
Well, there's an issue there with that, because remember, the French are already using their Moroccan soldiers, they're using the Senegalese soldiers, they're using soldiers from the French territory. They had some problems with regards to that, because the Senegalese grew up in Africa and France at the one time. It wasn't bad where I was. We fell below 32 degrees twice the whole time I was there, thank you goodness. But my friend who changed places with me, she grew up in ski country in France. But getting back to your question, the French had been fighting with the blacks, and so they had a different perception about it.
Right, so your two comments, sir, those were just the...
Yeah, the second-class citizenship must continue in France as it exists in America. That's the point that I'm making on the part of the American military. That was their perception. The blacks must not return to America with any expectation of equality. And I think I have that. So this is person's comments, or at least directive that went out to the French. You may have heard about this one. We must not eat with them, must not shake hands with them, seek to talk to them, or to meet with them outside the requirements of military service. We must not commend too highly these troops, especially in front of white Americans. And so they wanted to maintain that status going into France. On the other hand, remember that the black fighting divisions are also composed of men, especially the 93rd, which includes the Harlem Hill fighters, which we're about to talk to. These are composed of people who are laborers, but also doctors, lawyers, among the people in that particular group. An example in the trenches, I didn't have a chance to do this, but I have pictures of myself when I was on the personal tour for those 9 hours. I went into the bunkers. There's still bunkers left there from that particular time, and I do have some pictures of those. Hopefully, at some point, this thing will allow me to add a few more pictures describing that. The American Red Cross was one of the organizations that they felt was really working hard to create a sense of justice in terms of how they dealt with the men. But they also, again, had to work under pressure. And so this is part of what we saw. Now, the 369th Infantry, it was known as the New York 15th. And if you take a look at the 93rd Division here, you can see that New York, and then Illinois was really an all-black regiment, officers all the way down to the soldiers. And then you had the 371. That was made up primarily of black men from the South. And this was a group of people that was not as educated, many of them were not literate when they came into read. And then you have the 372. It's composed of people from D.C., Connecticut, Massachusetts, Ohio, Michigan, and Maryland, and so kind of combination. But this will be the group of men of the division in France. And it's not really a full division. This is Freddie Storrs. He's from the 371 group of guys that were there. And I want to mention this because this, again, is that Argonne Cemetery. Storrs, as it turns out, actually had been recommended for the Medal of Honor, but somehow it got lost. And they did not find it until George Bush was in office until 1993. And the other guy who was the most famous guy of the New York Regiment, which really brought honor and recognition not only to that, but to the country because of how he fought off the Germans, got here in 2015. They were given French helmets, French equipment for fighting, including the guns that were terribly made. But as you know, there's a whole different story, and I'm sure you know, so you have friends of people who are military scholars or historians who love doing this, and they can tell you about some of those guns. The French rifle was not a reliable rifle. Remember, this is a war where they're also learning technology, and it's evolving as this war is going on. The Springfields the American had were built by the Germans, and that was a copy of their rifles. So they had kind of limited equipment in some ways, but at the same time, they were also excited to be fighting with the French. And the French were complaining about men, the need for men, and so personally agreed to allow the 93rd Division to become a part of the French army, loaning them to the French, if you will, but the French would not give them back once they got them, because these men were essential and critical to the success on the battlefield. And as a kind of example of some of the places where they were during the war. This is a rendering of an artist looking at the Harlem Hellfighters. What had happened in New York is that the Harlem Hellfighters was actually a name given to the group by the Germans. The French called them men of bronze. And if you go back early on with black soldiers, you've heard the name Buffalo Soldiers. That's a name that came from Indians because of the name of their hair. They kind of reminded them of the hair of buffaloes. But legally constituted in 1913, but remember these things come out of politics. So nobody bothered, but when Whitman became governor, he decided to really start the regiment, to bring it to life, and he appointed the guy to your left here, Colonel Hayward. Hayward was a lawyer from Ohio, but he'd also worked in Washington where his dad was a politician, and he'd become very involved in New York and moved to New York, and he was the person brought in. So technically, when the regiment started, it was one man. This is the man who started the regiment. But it's going to be an all-black regiment. That's what it was supposed to be constituted as. Becoming this regiment was not easy. In fact, they assumed a hope that they would be a part of the Rainbow Division. He had started working with his men. They had a makeshift place there in Harlem. They started recruiting people. And they began recruiting people. And within, they were the first regiment in the country to be up to speed with a number of 2,000 men by the time they needed to go to training in New York State. And so Hayward was hoping that they would be a part of the infantry division when they were getting ready to march to New York City, to go out to camp, and he was told that black is not the color of the rainbow. And he was furious. And he said to the men, look, we're going to have our own parade when we come back to New York City after the war. And he held to that promise and did not back off from that. These are some of the guys who were the officers in this particular group. Hamilton Fish, Harvard football graduate, Spotswood Pose from the Black League. I don't want to block people. Am I blocking anyone? I don't want to block you. Okay, I'm blocking you. Okay, let me do this. Can you see, am I blocking you now?
No, it's good.
Okay, all right. So, George Robb, this guy had a phenomenal record, injured 3 or 4 times and kept fighting, won the Medal of Honor. This is the first black to actually pass the exam in the military, but he's also a Cornell graduate, founder of the Alpha Fraternity, and the first black registered architect in New York State. And so these are the people who were part of this regiment. This is the famous Noble Sicily, the musician. Oh, please.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. And this regiment suffered something like 3,000 casualties. But take a look at this. Rob won his medal in 1918, Stories in 1991, Henry Johnson in 2015. And if you take a look at the bottom, the entire New York regiment, and I think several others did, won the Croix. That's the famous medal that you give the French people. So the entire regiment won it. But they also won a number of other medals. And this is all a part of the recognition that came, really making the New York regiment the most famous of the group. Henry Johnson, I see this thing is blocking out my pictures. I don't know, but I'll go back to that. Henry Reese Johnson was the famous, Henry Reese is the guy who brought the famous band. When Hayward was asked to start the regiment, he was told to start a band. And this band, when they arrive in France, they arrive in Brest, he's actually told that he wanted the best band in the country, Hayward. And so, when they arrive in France, this band starts playing a jazz rendition of the French national anthem. It took them a few seconds to realize it. They loved it. They were selected out of the labor because they were not put to fighting. They were put on labor force. And this infuriated Hayward. And so they were put to digging ditches and building railroads. And they got this group. Hayward convinced the general to go hear them. They were so impressed, this group was able to go and tour France for a full month. 2 weeks first, and then a full month. And they were playing jazz and spirituals and other forms, and Noble Siskel was with them. I'm missing the flyer that I had of him. Amazing. And then they had the Hernandez brothers, because what happened was James Europe Reese actually recruited people from Puerto Rico, because they also could play types of instruments. Instead of having 15 band members, he had a band of about 42 people. Orchestra type of band member. I don't quite know what to do here, so let me just see. And I don't want to hold things up. Okay, I think we've lost quite a bit, so we may have to go on without the pictures. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay, let's just do that then. Okay, so the Harlem fighters, they arrived in Brest, and the French people were seeing blacks really for the first time, many of them, even though they had some natives there, but not from America. And so his band plays there for this month-long tour, then meets up with their regiment, which has now been assigned to the French. And James Hugh Reese was not just a great jazz musician and director, he was the first black to lead a group into war there in France. They fought alongside the French. They were treated as fellow French soldiers and treated as equals. And they also allowed the American blacks to form a positive attitude toward the French. Even though they still suffered from things, suffered from problems from the military police, the Americans. And in fact, when they came back from their tour and came back to the base where they was to Brest, several of them had suffered from abuse, and the leading officer said to them, "Why are you treating the men this way?" And he said, "Well, we were told to really bring down that New York force and bring them back under control." So they just started kind of attacking them physically, the police. But a summary of the action of the men there. They spent 191 days in the front line trenches, more than any other American unit. There was, at one point, nothing between the German army and Paris. This group had advanced so far they were trying to stop them because they didn't have a backup. And they were going forward. They never had a man captured. They caught 2 of them, but they got away. And when he was ordered to retreat, Hayward said, this is at Belleau Wood, I had a chance to go there, he said, "Turn back, I should say not. My men never retire. They go forward or they die." And so these men continued. In the Champagne Marne, these are the major battles, the Meuse-Argonne, Chateau Thierry, I was there, Belleau Wood. So they suffered nearly 1,500 casualties, nearly 6 months on the front line, and in recognition of their bravery during the offensive, 171 officers and men received medals, and the regiment also received, as I said, the Croix de Guerre. So they performed phenomenally in their experiences and in France. And as a result of this, you can see that they are coming home expecting to be treated as equal, but to make sure that they would not allow them that. But what happens is when they get ready to leave France to return home, you take a look at this notice here. This is a guy there. This would be a picture of that. That's the one that you saw early on with me there with him. When they come back to the United States, Am I good? Okay. Oh yes, this is what I want you to see. My men never retired. They go forward or they die. And indeed, the 369th were the first Allied unit to reach the Rhine. Yes?
So did they fight alongside the Marines at that point?
No, they were fighting with the French. Everything else is segregated in America. Yeah.
The Marines got their title of Devil Dog at Bella Woods also.
Is that right? Oh yeah. In fact, I have quite a few pictures, lots of pictures actually. I could only select a few of those, and we haven't had much cooperation today, but I think that may be a flaw in my, I should figure out what the problem is. But at any rate, you're right about that. And there was also another division, I cannot think of, they might have referred to them as a lost division. It was comprised of a lot of immigrants. They had difficulty getting respect, and they were treated, in fact, there's a book that's written that compares, it looks at these units and this particular division and how they were treated. And so yes, there were other divisions there in the same places. I have maps, you can see where they were and how they were fighting alongside beside each other. That was all a part of the experience. Am I on time or?
Yeah, we usually go for about an hour, so.
Oh, okay, all right, okay. Thank you. So that would allow me to also explain a few other things. One of the things, the arguments, for example, that he made when he was doing this is that, as you well know, this is war, and you have members, the army units, issues with disease, especially VD and things like that. Well, Hayward said to his men, you will all wear condoms. You will not have any disease. And when he was making the case to the person and the others, and we can't figure out exactly when that decision was made, because we know that when the general came and heard this band, that he was moved. And he said, look, we've got to send these guys on tour. And so, meanwhile, Hayward is trying to get word out that he wants his men to fight. And Person said, well, okay, give them to the French. We'll loan them to the French. But Hayward made the argument, look, my division is also my unit. It's the cleanest one here. All right, they don't have any disease with them. They're clean, they're healthy, they can fight, and they've also been trained. But as you well know, they also had to train them in the French equipment. And these guys were very, very good. And I can just tell you a bit more about Colonel Johnson, since we have some time on that. When he was on guard that night, and Freddie and the other guy who was with him, Needham Roberts. Roberts was about 16 or 17 years old. He lied to get into the army. These two guys were on post when the Germans threw in a grenade and injured Roberts. And Johnson was also hit, but Roberts was trying to reach him. And these two guys fought off this unit of Germans by themselves. And when he was injured, because Robert went to put in the bullet in his rifle, and he put the wrong one in, the American bullet. And the rifle didn't work. And so he was going with knife, bolo knife, grenades, everything he could. And even when he was down, Roberts kept throwing Johnson the grenades, and he fought them off. And the Germans retreated. They thought they were fighting all these people. And the next day, they found this blood, tracked them. They thought it must have been about 30 Germans there. But they killed people. They got back, and he managed to live behind this. And also, that was important because that was the very first. Those are the very first two guys to win the French Croix de Guerre from the Harlem Hellfighters of all the Americans there in France. Oh, this is the